You know the shape of the stones before you even read the words. But there is a massive problem with that assumption. Only after the history was written down did the treaty move to the third section, the stipulations, the rules, the list of things the lesser king was now required to do. Now, lay that baked clay tablet next to Exodus 20. God is not speaking into a cultural vacuum. He is not handing down a timeless, abstract philosophical code. He is adopting the geopolitical language of the late Bronze Age. He is speaking to a group of newly freed slaves using the exact legal architecture of an emperor claiming a newly acquired nation. He steps onto the mountain. He announces his name. He recites the historical prologue. And then he gives the stipulations. The Ten Commandments are not a disconnected list of moral suggestions. They are the stipulations of an imperial treaty. Look closely at the exact wording that opens the Sinai Treaty. I am the Lord your God. In English, it sounds like a generic religious title, the kind of phrase you expect from a distant deity. If you open a Bible to the book of Exodus, chapter 20, the place where this famous list is actually spoken out loud for the first time, you discover something strange. But the Hebrew text does not say Lord, it uses a specific, personal, unpronounceable name, Yahweh. I am Yahweh, your God. This is the preamble, the great king announcing his identity. He is not introducing himself as an abstract philosophical concept, he is laying down his claim as a sovereign. Then comes the historical prologue, the justification for everything that will follow. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery? This is where the legal weight of the treaty locks into place. Notice what God does not say. He does not say, I am the God who created the stars. He does not say, I am the God who set the boundaries of the oceans. Those things are cosmically true, but they are legally irrelevant to this specific contract. The leverage for this covenant is not creation, it is extraction. Look at the specific phrase used to describe Egypt, the house of slavery. In Hebrew, Beit Avadim. The word Avadim means slaves or servants, but the word Beit, house, makes it structural. Egypt was not just a geographic location on a map where bad things happened. It was an architecture of human ownership. For 400 years, more than half a dozen generations of men and women who lived, bled, and died without ever owning a single hour of their own labor, Israel was trapped in the mud and the brick pits. The first sentence out of the fire is not a rule. They were the physical engine of another empire's wealth. The whip was the only law they knew. God is citing this specific generational trauma as his legal standing. He is saying, you did not free yourselves. You did not negotiate a release. I broke the house open, I pulled you out of the mud, and I dismantled the empire that owned you. Your lives belong to me. This is not a polite request for voluntary devotion. It is a declaration of absolute ownership based on prior military rescue. The historical prologue permanently alters the foundation of biblical law. If the Ten Commandments simply begin with, do not murder, they are just universal ethics. But because they begin with, I brought you out, they become the binding obligation of a rescued people. And that obligation begins with a demand for absolute exclusivity. The moment the historical prologue establishes the rescue, the very first stipulation of the treaty drops. You shall have no other gods before me. In our modern ears, this sounds like a plea for religious monopoly, a slightly insecure deity demanding to be the favorite in a crowded room. We live in a world of personal religious preference. We treat theology like a consumer choice, where you pick the spiritual framework that best fits your internal life. It is a statement, But remember the clay tablets. Remember the political architecture of the Bronze Age. In a Suzerain-Vassal treaty, the primary demand of the great king was absolute, undivided loyalty. The lesser king was strictly forbidden from forming alliances with outside empires. He could not send tribute to the Hittites on Monday and sign a mutual defense pact with Egypt on Thursday. He could not have an independent foreign policy. To court another king while under the protection of the suzerain was not a difference of opinion, it was treason. It was an act of political rebellion that legally demanded military retaliation. When Yahweh says, "no other gods," he is not talking about private religious feelings. He is talking about geopolitical treason. The Hebrew phrase, translated "before me," is al-paneh. It literally means "to my face" or "in my presence." It is a spatial boundary. It means no rival flag can be planted in the territory I just conquered. No foreign ambassador can set up a throne in my court. Think about what it would mean for Israel to break this command. The Egyptian gods did not split the Red Sea. The Canaanite gods did not rain bread out of the sky. To turn around and offer tribute, sacrifice, and allegiance to the deities of the surrounding empires is not just bad theology. It is a fundamental breach of the contract that is actively keeping them alive in a wasteland. It is choosing to crawl back under the jurisdiction of the powers that just tried to exterminate them. The logic of the first commandment is entirely anchored in the prologue. The one who provided the deliverance holds the exclusive right to dictate the allegiance. You do not get extracted from the house of slavery by one king and then pay your taxes to another. That vertical loyalty is the absolute center of the covenant. Everything depends on it. But once that exclusive allegiance to the emperor is locked into place, the treaty pivots. It turns outward. It moves from how the rescued people must treat the king who saved them to how they are legally required to treat each other. And almost everyone skips it. It gets treated like a throat-clearing exercise before the real business of morality begins. The first 4 stipulations of the Sinai Treaty establish the vertical axis, absolute loyalty to the king. But then the stone pivots. The final 6 commandments build the horizontal axis, outlining exactly how the citizens of this newly formed nation must treat each other. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness. To modern eyes, this just looks like standard civic morality. Basic rules for keeping a society from imploding. Every civilization has some version of them, but look at them through the lens of the historical prologue. Look at them through the memory of the brick pits. But if you ignore that single opening line, the entire list fundamentally contradicts the story it belongs to. In the house of slavery, an Israelite did not own his own body. He did not own his own labor. Pharaoh could take a Hebrew life without consequence. A slave had no standing in an Egyptian court, which meant false witness was the default language of power. A slave could not amass property, which meant the concept of theft was irrelevant. You cannot steal from someone who owns nothing. So when Yahweh hands down these specific horizontal laws, he is not just issuing moral platitudes. He is handing them the architecture of a free society. He is legally recognizing their humanity. By forbidding theft, God is establishing that these former slaves now possess a divine right to own the fruit of their labor. By forbidding false witness, he is building an objective justice system where a peasant possesses the exact same legal standing as a tribal chief. Because these rules were never meant to be a general standalone moral test for humanity. By forbidding adultery and coveting, he is throwing a protective wall around the family unit. That is something empires routinely destroyed, splitting up husbands and wives whenever the labor supply demanded it. These laws are the exact mirror inverse of Egypt. They are not a ladder you climb to earn God's approval. They are the boundary markers of liberation. To break them, to steal, to oppress, to lie in court, is not just to commit a personal moral error. It is to resurrect the ghost of Pharaoh. It is to rebuild the house of slavery inside the camp of the rescued. And in the geopolitical world of the ancient Near East, violating the stipulations of a treaty carried catastrophic weight. These covenants did not end with polite suggestions. They ended with a formalized list of blessings and curses. They are a highly specific, historically bound legal document. If the vassal nation remained loyal and kept the laws, the empire provided military protection, rain for the crops, and secure borders. But if the vassal rebelled, if they tore up the social fabric or offered tribute to another king, the suzerain did not send a counselor, he sent an army. The ultimate consequence for breaking the Sinai Treaty was not a bad afterlife. It was the withdrawal of the great king's protection. It was the terrifying promise that if Israel insisted on acting like an empire, God would step back, let a new empire cross the border, and allow them to be dragged right back into the chains he pulled them out of. That framework, rescue first, obligation second, with exile as the ultimate consequence, did not stop at the edge of the mountain. It became the blueprint for the rest of the Bible. The mountain was not an isolated event. It was a mold. They follow the exact legal architecture of an ancient empire. Once you see the architecture of the historical prologue, the reality that deliverance must always precede duty, you start seeing it everywhere. It becomes the structural DNA of the entire biblical narrative. Fast forward a single generation. Moses is standing on the plains of Moab, staring across the Jordan River, delivering a massive farewell address before he dies. We call it the Book of Deuteronomy. The name itself means second law, but Moses does not begin by reciting the rules. He spends the first 4 chapters building a sprawling historical prologue. He reminds a brand new generation of everything Yahweh has done to keep them alive in the wilderness. The history must be re-established before the stipulations can be renewed. But the most striking place this ancient blueprint appears is more than 1,000 years later, translated into Greek in the letters of the New Testament. Look at the Apostle Paul. He was a Pharisee. He was trained in the deepest layers of the Torah. And we are going to look at what happens to the most famous moral code in history when we put its opening sentence back where it belongs. And when he writes his letters to the early Christian churches, he does not just borrow the theology of Sinai, he borrows the architecture. Take the letter to the Ephesians. It is 6 chapters long, and if you read it structurally, you hit a massive divide right down the middle. For the first 3 chapters, there are no behavioral commands, not a single moral demand. Instead, Paul writes a sprawling, breathless historical prologue. He explains how God invaded history, how he broke the power of death, how he extracted a people out of the domain of darkness and bought them with blood. It is an empire-shattering rescue. Then you hit chapter 4, verse 1. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Therefore, that single word acts exactly like Exodus 22. It is the hinge of the treaty. 2 rounded tablets, usually carved from granite, resting in the arms of a prophet on a mountain. We are going to see how the original ancient context destroys the idea of a moral checklist and what it actually changes about the way the Bible views the law. It is the pivot from prologue to stipulation. Only after 3 chapters of unearned grace does Paul finally introduce the horizontal laws of the new community. Tell the truth, do not steal, forgive your neighbor, If you cut the letter in half and only read the back end, you are left with a crushing moral checklist. You are back in the transactional trap, trying to earn a standing you assume you do not have. But Paul refuses to hand down a rule without first grounding it in a rescue. He knows that if you detach the law from the deliverance, the law becomes a tyrant. The logic of Sinai survives intact. You do not behave so that God will save you. You behave because God has already saved you. And that fundamentally changes what happens in the human heart when the commandments are read. If you take Exodus 20 and completely erase the historical prologue, to understand the shock of that first sentence, you have to look at the text itself. Exodus 20 begins like this. You are left with a religion of anxiety. You are left with a transaction, a desperate, never-ending negotiation where you are constantly trying to balance the scales, hoping your moral resume is heavy enough to force God to accept you. But the moment you put that single sentence back where it belongs, the entire system flips. The 10 Commandments are not a negotiation. They are a declaration that the negotiation is already over. The great king did not stand at the border of Egypt and offer a conditional contract to the slaves. He did not ask for a down payment. He waded into the brick pits, dismantled the superpower that held them. And God spoke all these words, saying, and dragged his people across the sea. When you realize that deliverance precedes duty, obedience stops being a currency you use to buy God's love. It becomes the only sane response to the fact that you already have it. It becomes gratitude. You do not avoid idols to earn your freedom. You avoid idols because you have seen what false gods do to human beings, and you have seen what the true God did to the sea. You do not tell the truth and protect your neighbor to climb a ladder to heaven. You do it because you are building a society that looks like the king who saved you instead of the empire that crushed you. The rules do not make you free. Then comes the sentence that changes the world. The rules are how free people stay free. Think back to that ubiquitous image of the stone tablets, those two rounded pieces of carved granite. When you see them now, do not look at them as a cosmic entry exam. Do not look at them as a crushing weight of moral demands hovering in a vacuum. Look at them as the physical artifact of a rescue mission, the ink on the imperial treaty, the definitive proof that a God exists who does not wait for slaves to clean themselves up. Before he breaks down the door of the house they are trapped in, he saves them first. He calls them his own, and only then does he show them how to live. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. If seeing the ancient context changes how you read these texts, the biggest thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs it. That is genuinely how people find this work. We rely on you to help spread the word. Please keep us in your prayers. God bless you. Notice what is missing. There is no thou shalt. There is no behavioral demand. There is no threat. There is only a terrifyingly loud voice making a historical claim. Only after that claim is established does the first command fall. You shall have no other gods before me. Think about what that sequence means. It is the most recognizable piece of religious iconography in the world, the 10 Commandments. If the 10 Commandments are an entry exam, the timing of the Bible is completely backward. An exam comes before you get the reward. A test is what determines your status. If this was a behavioral ladder, the rules should have been handed down in the brick pits of Egypt. God should have stood before the slaves and said, "Stop lying, stop stealing, and stop worshiping Egyptian deities. If you can do this perfectly for a generation, I will rescue you." But he didn't. The rescue happened while they were still deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. The sea was parted before they ever saw a stone tablet. which means the rules do not create the relationship. We treat them like a cosmic entry exam. The base of Mount Sinai is not a soft place. It is a brutal, jagged expanse of fractured granite, baked dust, and dry wind. When the Israelites finally camp at the foot of this mountain in Exodus 19, the text gives us a very specific timestamp. It is the 3rd month after they walked out of Egypt, roughly 90 days, a single financial quarter. That is how long they have been free. It is just enough time for the physical bruises from the slave drivers to fade to yellow, but not nearly enough time to unlearn the mental terror of the brick pits. And in those 90 days, notice what has already happened. The Red Sea has been split. The Egyptian army has been drowned. A 10-point moral checklist floating in a vacuum designed to measure human goodness. Bread has rained out of the sky to feed them in a wasteland. Water has violently poured out of a cracked rock to keep them from dying of thirst. And through all of that, they did not have a single moral law to follow. They did not earn the bread. They did not split the rock. They did not pass a behavioral test to get the water. They simply cried out, and they were rescued. They are already standing on the safe side of the sea. This chronology creates massive friction against how we naturally want to read the Bible. Human beings are deeply, fundamentally wired for transactions. Keep the rules, God is pleased. Break the rules, God is angry. We understand wages. We understand contracts. You do the work, you get the payout. You follow the rules, you get the reward. So when we look at the 10 Commandments, we instinctively project our transactional nature onto them. We assume God is holding up a list of demands and saying, if you do this, I will save you. But the timeline of the mountain violently rejects that premise. If the law is a prerequisite for salvation, the timing is a disaster. God gave the application form after the job was already granted. The Egyptian empire is a graveyard, and the people standing in the dust at Sinai are completely, unconditionally liberated, which means the law is not the engine of their deliverance, it is the result. They are not being given rules so they can become God's people. They are being given rules because they already are. Do enough of the right things, and you might just earn your way into heaven. The 10 Commandments are not an entry interview for the kingdom of heaven. They are the household rules for a people who have already been brought inside. But that still leaves a massive question. If these 10 statements are not a universal moral test, then what exactly are they? Why did God choose this specific format? Why begin with a historical claim about Egypt, followed immediately by a list of exclusive demands? To answer that, you have to look outside the Bible. You have to look at the geopolitical reality of the world Israel had just walked into. Because the structure of Exodus 20 was not invented on the mountain, it was already famous. The ancient Near East during the Late Bronze Age was not an empty map of wandering nomads. It was a world of superpowers. That is how the Decalogue exists in the modern imagination. More than a millennium before the Roman Empire existed, empires like the Egyptians and the Hittites controlled the world through military force and complex diplomacy. When a massive superpower conquered a smaller nation, or when it rescued a weaker city-state from an invading army, the two kings did not just shake hands. They forged a very specific, highly formalized legal document to bind the two nations together. Historians and archaeologists call it a Suzerain-Vassal treaty. Suzerain is simply a political term for the great king. The emperor, the overlord, the vassal is the lesser king, the subordinate nation whose survival now depends on the empire. Over the last century, archaeologists digging in the ruins of the ancient Hittite Empire in the dust of modern-day Turkey have pulled dozens of these treaties out of the ground. They are baked clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform script. And when scholars translated them, they realized that these empires did not just write random lists of laws, they used a rigid, universally recognized legal blueprint. Every treaty followed the same exact pattern. It is a behavioral ladder. First came the preamble. The great king would announce exactly who was speaking, projecting absolute authority. These are the words of Suppiluliuma, the great king, the king of the Hatti land. Then came the second section. This piece was mandatory, and it is the key to understanding everything that happens at Sinai. It is called the historical prologue. Before the great king demanded a single ounce of tribute, before he laid down one law, he would recount the history of the relationship. He would remind the lesser king of everything the empire had done for him. I protected your borders. I destroyed your enemies. When you were starving, I sent grain. I rescued you from the hands of your rivals and put you on the throne. The logic of this was brilliant. The great king was establishing the legal basis for his demands. He was saying, I am not asking for your loyalty out of nowhere. I am demanding your loyalty because I already bought your life.